All right, it's time to take a look at the Chiefs' initial 53-man roster following the cutdowns today, which definitely features some surprising players being waived, a receiver being traded to the Panthers, the Chiefs acquiring a defensive tackle from the Raiders, and much freaking more. But first, how about those? First off, before we take a look at all these cutdowns, there's a few helpful terms that you need to be in the know about if you aren't already. The term waived applies only to players with less than 4 seasons of NFL time accrued, meaning they are subject to waivers and can be claimed by other teams. If they go unclaimed after the 24-hour waiver period, though, they become a free agent. A player can accrue a season if they are on a team's 53-man roster for at least 6 games. And that's why throughout this video, you're going to hear me say if a player gets waived, hopefully some of them can land on the Chiefs practice squad if they make it far enough through waivers for the Chiefs to pick them up. Next up is the term released. If a player has 4 or more accrued seasons in the NFL, they are considered a vested veteran and are not subject to waivers. So they can become free agents immediately when they are released. And this is the case until the NFL trade deadline in October. But for right now, there's no waivers for the veterans and they are listed as released. And then finally, waived/injured. Basically, this means that non-vested players must be placed on waivers through the waived/injured designation before being placed on injured reserve. And this measure prevents teams from stashing young players on IR. Once a waived/injured player clears waivers, he reverts to the team's IR. And after cutdown day, teams can then use the waived/injured designation, or they can place a non-vested player directly on IR. The team can then decide whether it wants to move forward with the player or release him with an injury settlement. All right, with all that being said, here we go. The Chiefs opted to roll with 2 quarterbacks, Patrick Mahomes and Blaine Gabbert. They then waived, to everybody's surprise, Chris Oladokun, which wasn't that much of a surprise, but also Shane Buechele, which was a much bigger surprise in my opinion. And if any of these guys clear waivers, they could land on the Chiefs practice squad. Shane Buechele may have been the most surprising player waived of the entire roster, especially with the new 3rd emergency QB rule that got approved for this NFL season. But there you have it. The Chiefs, for now, are just rolling with 2. Next up, the Chiefs opted for only 3 running backs, with those being Isaiah Pacheco, Jerick McKinnon, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. They then ended up waiving Jerrion Ealy, but also Deneric Prince and La'Mical Pirine, which is a bit of a surprise that neither of those guys stayed on as RB4. However, once again, if either of those guys clear waivers, they should find themselves on the Chiefs practice squad. Hopefully both, or all 3 rather, but we will find out because La'Mical Pirine had a great preseason and he could very well get snagged up by another team. And then for the first time in Andy Reid's tenure as the Chiefs head coach, they are rolling with 7 receivers on the initial 53, with those being MVS, Kadarius Toney, Sky Moore, Rashee Rice, Justin Watson, Richie James, and Justin Ross. So let's freaking go. Justin Ross made it. You love to see it, which then of course means they waived everybody else. Jawan Green, Ty Fogel, Isaiah Gathings, Cornell Powell, and Ty Scott. One lone receiver was listed as waived injured, and that was Nico Remigio, who dislocated his shoulder a couple weeks ago at training camp. And last but not least, the Chiefs also traded Ihmir Smith-Marsette to the Carolina Panthers in exchange for a swap of conditional 2025 7th-round picks. And I know some wanted Smith-Marsette on the roster, but the room was simply too competitive, and therefore, I wish him his best in the next chapter with the Panthers. Again, writing was on the wall. Justin Watson, who a lot of people wanted to go, was rolling exclusively with the ones. Meanwhile, Ihmir Smith-Marsette, who was balling out, yes, but he was doing that against teams' 3rd and 4th string defense. And so there you have it. Ihmir Smith-Marsette goes to the Panthers. Justin Watson remains on the roster. Next up, the Chiefs went with just 3 tight ends, with those being Travis Kelce, Noah Gray, and Blake Bell, which also means they waived Matt Bushman, who hopefully lands on the practice squad, and then they released veteran Kendall Blanton. So a little bit of a surprise. They're only rolling with 3, especially considering the Chiefs have no fullback, and they're going to use some of these guys as an H-back. That's a tight end fullback hybrid, but we'll have to see if they add any more guys here after a little bit of time. And then the Chiefs have 10 offensive linemen on the initial 53, with those being the 5 starters: left tackle Donovan Smith, left guard Joe Thuney, center Creed Humphrey, right guard Trey Smith, and right tackle Jawan Taylor. Then they also have Prince Tega Wanogho, Nick Allegretti, Wanye Morris, Lucas Niang, and Mike Caliendo. They then waived Sebastian Gutierrez, Jason Godric, Anderson Hardy, and surprisingly also last year's 5th round draft pick in Darian Kennard, who may very well end up on the practice squad. They then listed Jerome Carvin as waived injured and also released veteran center Austin Ryder. And from here, I want to take a look at the defensive side of the ball as well as some players that could still find themselves on short-term IR after cutdowns. But first, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Underdog Fantasy, the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. Underdog is also the official fantasy sports company of the HBTC channel for the 2023 NFL season, and the weekly winners contest on Underdog is available now. This is a unique fantasy football format that rewards players for having the highest scoring teams each week, which means you have to be focused on drafting players who have the potential to score big points even if they're not the most consistent performers. And what makes this so fun is you are competing against all contest entries each week, not just those in your draft group. Even though I am running some private drafts with the HBTC community, like this $10 entry 12-person draft and another $25 entry 10-person draft. I have links to both of those private drafts as well as my sign-up link to Underdog in the description, but just remember to use code HBTC to get your first deposit of up to $100 matched. All right, let's look at the defensive side of the ball, starting with the defensive line, and there's a lot here, so buckle up. They opted to roll with 10 defensive linemen, with those being Turk Wharton, Derek Nottie, Keandre Coburn, Malik Herring, Matt Dickerson, Mike Dana, George Karlaftis, Felix Anudike-Uzama, and BJ Thompson. And yes, that is only 9 if you were counting. However, they also acquired defensive tackle Neil Farrell via trade with the Raiders in exchange for a 6th round pick, which is probably a wise move to shore up some depth on what I perceive to be one of the weaknesses of the team right now, with Turk Wharton still not 100% from his ACL tear last year. Danny Shelton just got released, and then Chris Jones got moved to the reserve / did not report list, which basically means, as of right now, Chris Jones does not count against the Chiefs roster limit or its salary cap. And then you also will notice that Charles Omenihu is not on the list, and that's because he's on the reserve suspended list, I think it is off the top of my head, but he's suspended for the first 6 weeks of the season and also will not take up a roster spot during that time. Anyway, on top of all of that, they also waived Phil Hoskins, Truman Jones, Joshua Kando, Chris Williams, and Daniel Wise. Anyway, about the defensive tackle the Chiefs traded for from the Raiders, Neil Farrell. He was the number 8 defensive tackle in the 2022 draft class, according to The Athletic's Dane Brugler. He's 24 years old, 6'4", 325 pounds, and he played a limited sample size with the Raiders last year, only playing in 9 games, starting in 0, but recorded 12 tackles, a tackle for loss, and 2 QB hits. It's merely just a depth piece, in my opinion, with Colin Saunders also going to the Saints on top of all the other things I listed going on with the defensive tackles on the team right now. Next up, the Chiefs actually decided to go with 6 linebackers, with those being Nick Bolton, Willie Gay, Drew Tranquill, Leo Chanel, Jack Cochran, and Cam Jones. They then waived Cole Christensen and listed Olakunle Fatukasi as waived / injured. It's a little surprising they rolled with 6, but I'm curious to see how injured Leo Chanel is, as he sustained a hip pointer in this last preseason game. Andy Reid said it's pretty minor, but they're rolling with 6, so I'm definitely curious to see if Leo Chanel's injury played a role, if at all. Now, looking at the secondary, the Chiefs went with 5 cornerbacks: L'Jarius Sneed, Trent McDuffie, Jalen Watson, Joshua Williams, and Nick Jones. And then they went with 4 safeties, with those being Justin Reed, Brian Cook, Mike Edwards, and Chamari Connor. They then waived DiCaprio Bootle, Echo Boydo, Anthony Cook, Khalifa Lassie, Lamar Jackson, the defensive back, Deron Lowe, Isaiah Norman, and Reese Taylor. And then they also released veteran safety Dion Bush. And it's a little bit of a surprise to me they're only rolling with 5 cornerbacks, but we'll get more as to why that is to me here in just a moment. But first, we saved the best for last, and that is, to nobody's surprise, they went with 3 specialists: kicker Harrison Butker, punter Tommy Townsend, and long snapper James Winchester. And with all that being said, that is the Chiefs' 53-man roster with 5 potential players that I'm looking at to watch out for that could potentially be placed on IR tomorrow and would then be eligible to return after a minimum of 4 weeks, with those players being wide receiver Kadarius Toney, offensive lineman Nick Allegretti, cornerback L'Jarius Sneed, and cornerback Nick Jones, and then linebacker Leo Chanel. Wide receiver Kadarius Toney injured his knee first day of training camp. Had surgery, a cleanup of sorts, pretty minor. The report / rumors are he could return for week 1, though we will see how conservative they end up being with him. Offensive lineman Nick Allegretti hurt his shoulder last week in practice, and so I'm definitely curious to see if he gets moved for a bit, and that's why they have Mike Caliendo in there as Offensive lineman number 10, cornerback L'Jarius Sneed has been battling a knee injury since the postseason. He was listed on the injury report before the AFC Championship game, and then I think before the divisional as well. He missed out on OTAs, missed out on minicamp, half of training camp, and he's still not quite right with that knee. And then cornerback Nick Jones fractured a couple fingers in the first preseason game. Then you have Leo Chanel, who I just talked about, sustained a hip pointer in that last preseason game. So those are the 5 I am looking for that could potentially be placed on IR for about 4 weeks minimum. Could be longer, but these guys are all battling injuries of some kind, and if the Chiefs felt they weren't quite ready, they could place a couple of them on IR. Not saying they all will go, not all 5, maybe a couple, but they could return after a few weeks, and what that would do is allow the Chiefs to re-sign a couple of veterans they released today, because vested veterans don't currently need to clear waivers yet. So we could see the return of maybe safety Deon Bush if Sneed or Nick Jones were to be put on IR, or maybe even the return of Danny Shelton if Turk Wharton is possibly placed on IR. There's also players that the Chiefs could claim off waivers that we are still unaware of. Those are a few scenarios I could see playing out. With all that being said, that means my initial 53-man roster got 46 out of 53 correct. So definitely close, but no cigar. I had them rolling with 3 quarterbacks instead of 2, 4 running backs instead of 3. I did get the 7 wide receivers correct. Then I went with 9 offensive linemen instead of 10, but I had Darian Kennard making the roster. He got waived. I also hesitantly pulled off Lucas Niang because I wasn't sure what to do with him based on how many quarterbacks, running backs, and receivers I had, but they kept him on there, and they also added Mike Caliendo. For the D-line, I also had Chris Jones on the did not report list, as well as Minihue not on the roster due to his 6-week suspension. But I also only had 9 defensive linemen instead of the Chiefs' 10 that they listed. I did not have Matt Dickerson on there. And then I kept Danny Shelton, who was released. And then, of course, had no idea they would be trading for Neil Farrell. For linebackers, I had the Chiefs rolling with 5, and they actually went with 6, adding Cam Jones as number 6. Part of me wonders if they added a 6 because of Leo's hip pointer, but time will tell there. Then for defensive backs, I had 6 corners, but the Chiefs went with 5, removing Khalif Halassi, who was my unsure number 6 pick. And the reason I went with 6 is because of the unknowns around Sneed's tweaked knee and Nick Jones' fractured fingers. However, with Chamari Connor being able to play all over the secondary, linebacker Drew Tranquil being a converted safety, some of these DBs landing on the practice squad, and Deon Bush possibly able to return once a player or 2 gets moved to IR, the Chiefs probably still feel fine with 5 corners instead of 6. I also got the safeties right with 4, and then the specialists right with 3. And with all that being said, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. The Chiefs have their official initial 53-man roster out, and to recap it all, the Chiefs went with 2 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 7 wide receivers, 3 tight ends, 10 offensive linemen, 10 defensive linemen, 6 linebackers, 5 cornerbacks, 4 safeties, 3 specialists, and that brings the total to 53, with more changes to come in the very near future. However, what are your thoughts on the initial 53-man roster? Are you surprised at all by Shane Buechele being waived, or not really? And what about the Chiefs only rolling with 3 running backs, considering Isaiah Pacheco just got cleared for full contact with his shoulder, and CEH has been injured for part of almost every season he's been in the NFL? And then do you think Deneric Prince and or LaMichael Pirine could end up making it to the Chiefs practice squad? Definitely let me know your biggest surprises on both sides of the ball and your thoughts on all I just asked you about. And until next time, let's go. Let's freaking go. How about those?